I dropped out of school, worked 7 years nonstop to save my family's store. One night, I saw my brother step out of a sports car with his girlfriend. Turns out he used a loan in my name to travel. I asked my mom. She said costs went up, sweetie. Then she added, "You were never the one I trusted." If you think this is just another family story, you're dead wrong. Subscribe now so you don't miss the next spine-chilling episode. Melissa stood still among the shifting figures, her arms locked around a small mahogany box, the urn. Her father's ashes. It was heavier than it should have been. Not because of weight, but because of everything it now symbolized: the end of laughter in the kitchen at midnight, the smell of fresh lumber from his workshop, the quiet way he used to place a hand on her back when she was about to fall apart. It was final, and she wasn't ready for it. Next to her, Clara, their mother, was trembling with what looked like grief. Her face blotched, mascara running, voice cracking between sobs. But Melissa had lived long enough with that woman to know how well she could perform when there was an audience. Clara clutched a crumpled tissue with the grace of a grieving widow, whispering, "He was everything to anyone who passed." And they believed her. Why wouldn't they? Alex, standing on the other side of the casket earlier, had kept his hands shoved into the pockets of his black suit jacket, like he was at a boring meeting. Now, outside the chapel, he leaned against the hood of someone else's car, chain-smoking beneath the cover of a borrowed umbrella, avoiding everyone's eyes. His tie was crooked, his shirt untucked in the back. Melissa didn't even know if he'd cried, not once. They were a family on paper. But today, as the last few mourners drifted toward their cars and the pastor offered his final condolences, Melissa felt like a foreigner inside her own bloodline. "Come," Clara murmured, her voice trembling as she looped her arm through Melissa's. "Let's go home. There's something we need to talk about." Melissa didn't respond. She only held the urn tighter. The house hadn't changed much. Same floral wallpaper peeling slightly at the corners, same oil painting of the lake cabin they never visited, same faint scent of lemon cleaner and hidden rot beneath it. But the silence was louder now. It hung heavy in every room. Clara insisted on making tea, a mechanical ritual that gave her something to do with her hands. Melissa sat at the kitchen table, the urn still pressed to her chest. Across from her, Alex had taken to scrolling his phone, one leg bouncing restlessly. When the kettle whistled, Clara moved quickly, pouring water over 2 tea bags in mismatched mugs. Hers, of course, was bone china. Melissa's was a chipped mug from her old high school debate team, a memory no one ever acknowledged anymore. Clara sat down, folding her hands slowly. Her eyes were red, not just from tears. There was something else. Fatigue, regret, strategy. "Sweetheart," she began. The word landed with too much sugar. "We need to talk about next steps." Melissa stared. "Next steps?" "The store," Clara continued gently, "is not in a good place. Your father, well, you know how proud he was. He kept a lot from us. The debts, the late notices, he didn't want to worry anyone." Melissa blinked. "He talked to me about everything. He told me things were tight, but that we'd be okay." Clara flinched. For a second, something cold flashed in her eyes, but she covered it with a well-timed sigh. "Melissa, honey," she said, reaching across the table, her fingers brushing the edge of Melissa's sleeve. "You've always been the strong one, the responsible one. I don't know what I'd do without you." "I'm still enrolled for the spring," Melissa said flatly. "Dad wanted me to finish." "I know," Clara said quickly, then softened her voice. "But we need help now, just for a little while. The store's all we have left. I can't run it alone, not with the suppliers calling and the bills." And Alex, Melissa cut in, eyes narrowing at her brother. "What about him?" Alex didn't even glance up. "I'm not made for retail," he mumbled, thumb still swiping. Clara jumped in before the room could ice over. "Your brother's trying. He's looking at online business courses. He needs some space to what?" Melissa snapped. "Be young. Experiment with life while I hold everything together." Clara's expression hardened slightly, but her tone remained soothing, manipulative. "You're so good at managing people. Your father always said you had a gift for business. Just 1 year, maybe 2. Help us get through this rough patch, then you go back. We'll even use part of the inheritance to fund your return." Melissa's mouth went dry. "There's an inheritance." Clara hesitated. That pause was everything. "Well, nothing formal yet. Your father never finalized a will. But the store is his legacy. It's what he would have wanted." "No, it wasn't." Melissa could hear her father's voice echo in her mind. "You're gonna finish college, baby girl. Get out of this town. You're meant for more than aisles and registers." But he was gone, and this was what remained. Clara's voice dropped into a plea now. "Melissa, please. I don't want to lose the shop. It's all we have left of him. Of us. Melissa looked down at the urn. The smooth wood. The brass plate etched with his name. She tried to summon his strength, his clarity, but the grief was too loud. Her chest tightened. She didn't say yes, but she didn't say no. She simply nodded once her knuckles white against the dark grain of the urn. Clara exhaled in relief, hiding the smirk behind her teacup. Outside, the rain slowed. And Melissa, though she didn't know it yet, had just signed away the next 7 years of her life. By the time the morning light crept over the cracked asphalt outside the store, Melissa had already been awake for 2 hours. The sky was still a shade of steel gray when she unlocked the front door of Carter's Market, the same key her father had once carried hooked to his belt loop, always jingling softly like a promise of order. Now it hung from her own keychain beside a tiny flashlight, and a frayed lanyard from her college orientation, an ironic souvenir of the life she'd left behind. The fluorescent lights buzzed as she flipped the switch, casting a dull glow across the shelves. She made a mental note of what needed restocking: canned beans, laundry detergent, cat food. Her fingers were already stained with ink from last night's ledgers, and her shoulders ached from the early delivery she'd taken in solo at dawn. The pallet jack had a broken wheel again. No one had bothered fixing it. She wheeled the dolly back to the stockroom hands, calloused from weeks of repetition. Melissa could already smell the overripe bananas sitting in the fruit basket by the register, and made a quick decision: discount them by 40% before lunch. Someone might bite. She moved without thinking now. Inventory, shelf check, freezer defrost. The rhythm of survival. Her father had once joked that running a store was like conducting a symphony of chaos. Timing was everything, but nobody clapped at the end. Now the music played only in her head, and she was the sole conductor. The phone rang mid-morning. Melissa wiped her hands on her apron and answered, balancing the receiver between her ear and shoulder while scanning a supplier invoice. Carter's Market. Hi, this is Julia from Benson Distribution. Just following up on the late payment third notice. Melissa felt the weight settle on her chest again. Yes, I've seen the statement. We had a delay with our banking transfer, but I'll get that sorted by Friday. You said that last week, Melissa. I know, I'm doing my best. There was a pause, long and uncomfortable. Julia softened just a bit. All right, Friday, but no more delays. Melissa hung up and exhaled slowly, closing her eyes. The ledger was bleeding red. She opened the drawer and stared at the petty cash bag half empty. She could either pay Benson or the water bill, but not both. She chose Benson. By noon, her hands were stiff-dry from cleaning solution and bleach. She had reorganized the back freezer, sorted through returns, and dealt with an angry customer who screamed at her over expired peanut butter 3 days past date. She apologized, replaced it with a fresh one, and even threw in a discount. That was what her father would have done. What he wouldn't have done, however, was vanish from the ledger entirely. His presence used to live in every corner of the shop. His handwriting still dotted the old inventory binders. Always smile first, he'd written on a post-it taped to the register. But lately that paper was curling at the edges, fading into the background like everything else he'd touched. Like he had. After a small sandwich devoured in under 3 minutes, Melissa checked her phone out of habit. A new Instagram story from Alex. Her breath hitched. He was on a rooftop somewhere, sunny, exotic, sipping what looked like a mojito beside a pool. The caption read, "Business meetings can wait. Hashtag work hard, play hard." She stared at the screen, expression unreadable. He'd told their mother he was scouting supplier relations in Phoenix this week. Apparently that meant bottle service in Miami. Melissa locked the phone and shoved it back into her apron. She didn't have time to scream. That afternoon, Clara waltzed into the store like she was dropping by a boutique in Milan. Her hair was pinned in a salon bun, nails freshly done, perfume trailing behind her like expensive deflection. "Oh, honey," she said breezily, glancing around without much interest. "It's still so dim in here. We really ought to change those lights." Melissa kept wiping the countertop, voice even. "I can't afford new lights, Mom." Clara frowned, but only lightly. Well, when your father was around. When Dad was around, the bills were paid, Melissa cut in. Clara blinked at the tone, then she smiled, condescending. "You're so stressed. You really need to take a breath. I'm heading to my noon massage appointment. Want me to book you one too?" Melissa just looked at her. Clara clicked her tongue. "Suit yourself?" As she turned to leave, Melissa called after her. "Did you know Alex is in Miami?" Clara stopped back still to her. "He's networking." "In swim trunks?" Clara hesitated. "It's called lifestyle branding, sweetheart. You wouldn't understand. Let your brother handle things his way." Melissa's jaw tensed so tightly it felt like her teeth would crack. I thought we were in debt. Clara turned, then eyes glittering with something that didn't resemble concern. We are. But we have you. And you've always been so good at making things work, haven't you? The door chimed as she walked out, her heels clicking against the sidewalk. Each step sounded like a nail being driven into Melissa's resolve. By early evening, the shadows inside the store stretched longer, curling around the base of the shelves like fatigue itself. Melissa moved slower now. Her back was tight, her feet numb inside shoes she hadn't replaced in over a year. She swept the floor with measured strokes, eyes glassy. Outside, the streetlights flickered on. The reflection of her own face stared back from the front window, tired, drawn, and older than she remembered. She thought about the email from her college automatic reminder of registration deadlines, the cursor blinking like a slow heartbeat. Her textbooks from 2 semesters ago were still stacked in her bedroom under a blanket of dust and deferred dreams, but still she stayed. Because they'd promised. Because she was told she mattered. That her sacrifice would mean something. That this weight would one day be lifted. But as she turned the sign to closed and locked the doors behind her, a whisper crawled into her ear with the finality of truth. They were never going to lift it. They were always going to let her carry it, alone. It was a Wednesday afternoon when the first crack appeared. Melissa had been rushing through deliveries all day, her van rattling like it might fall apart at the next stoplight. The brakes were soft again, the check engine light blinking its usual warning like an old friend she no longer feared. She had one more delivery. 3 crates of dry goods to a small coffee shop near the west end of town, and her back already ached from lifting the bulk order of canned tomatoes earlier that morning. The lot behind the cafe was cramped, the pavement uneven and littered with broken glass. As she shifted into park, Melissa caught a flicker of movement in her peripheral vision, a car door swinging open, loud laughter piercing the air. At first she didn't pay it much mind, but then she turned her head. Her breath caught. It was Alex. He stepped out of a sleek, matte black Mercedes convertible. The kind of car that didn't belong anywhere near the neighborhood they grew up in. The rims alone probably cost more than Carter's Market's entire monthly inventory. Alex was wearing aviators, crisp white sneakers, and a designer bomber jacket Melissa had seen once in a magazine ad, price tag $300. His hand was wrapped casually around the waist of a woman with fire-red hair skin, kissed by expensive tanning oil, and a laugh that sounded like it had never echoed through anything less than a 5-star resort. Melissa ducked slightly behind the van's door instinctively. Not out of fear, but out of disbelief. She watched as Alex leaned in to kiss the girl, then tossed his keys to the valet like he'd done it 1,000 times. He said something Melissa couldn't hear it, but the girl laughed again louder this time, clutching his arm like he was the most important man in the world. Then they walked into the restaurant next door, one of those high-end tapas places where the appetizers cost more than her weekly groceries. Melissa didn't move. She stood frozen in the smell of engine oil and stale cardboard, heart thudding, stomach twisting with something between rage and confusion. For a moment, her brain tried to protect her whispering explanations. Maybe it was a rental. Maybe it was business. Maybe he was just putting on a show. But no explanation made sense. Not when last week Clara had sobbed over dinner claiming they couldn't afford new uniforms for the store staff. Not when the power had nearly been shut off until Melissa wired money from her own emergency savings to cover the overdue bill. Not when she had skipped a dentist appointment she'd needed for months because even the copay felt like too much. And here was Alex, dressed like a music producer, draped in wealth, ordering cocktails at 3 in the afternoon. By the time Melissa made it back to the store, her hands were shaking on the steering wheel. That night after closing, she sat at the small desk in the back office, the air stale with the scent of ink toner and dust. The overhead bulb flickered every few minutes, casting shadows across the cluttered surface. She pulled out the ledger and began combing through the latest transactions. The numbers didn't lie. There it was, a new line item dated 3 weeks ago. Bridge Capital Loan, $25,000. Melissa didn't remember signing off on that. Her stomach turned. The note beside the entry read, "Approved by partner. For renovation capital." Except there were no renovations. The ceiling still leaked when it rained. The refrigerators still made that rattling sound. No work orders, no permits, no paint, no anything. Partner. The word scratched at her nerves. She checked the attached account funds routed through their joint business account, the one she thought only she and Clara had access to. Her hands were trembling now. She printed the transaction, circled it in red pen. Then she started flipping backward through old statements. Another small loan 6 weeks ago, $5,000. Labeled equipment upgrade. Then another unmarked entirely. Transfers, withdrawals, names she didn't recognize. She pulled out her calculator but didn't need to do the math. The total was enough to make her nauseous. Later that evening, Clara emerged from her room wrapped in a silk robe, her skin glowing from some citrus-scented facial oil. She poured herself a glass of white wine and hummed a tune Melissa didn't recognize. Melissa stepped into the doorway of the kitchen. "We need to talk." Clara didn't turn. "Can it wait until morning? I've had the longest day." "No," Melissa said, voice firmer now. "It can't." Clara sighed and took a sip of wine before turning her expression equal parts weariness and annoyance. "All right, what is it?" Melissa held up the paper the statement circled in red. "What is this?" Clara took a long look at it, her eyes narrowing slightly. Then she tilted her head and gave a small practiced smile. "A loan." "For what?" Melissa asked. Clara shrugged. "Operating expenses. You know how things are these days. Prices are up. Suppliers are less forgiving. We needed some room to breathe." $25,000, Mom. "Well, that's what they offered. Better than nothing." Melissa took a step closer. "Who approved it?" "I did. I'm still a partner, aren't I?" Melissa didn't blink. "And Alex, is he a partner too?" Clara's smile faltered. Just a flicker, but it was enough. Melissa's voice dropped to a whisper. "I saw him today. In a brand new Mercedes. With some girl. They went into Juniper Lounge like they owned it." Clara looked away, eyes suddenly very interested in the grain of the countertop. "Is that where the loan went?" Melissa asked, now trembling. "Are we paying for his weekends while I'm here counting nickels to pay the power bill?" Clara placed the wine glass down gently. "Don't be dramatic." Melissa almost laughed. "Dramatic? You told me we were drowning, that we had nothing. I've been working double shifts. I gave up school, and you're telling me I'm dramatic." Clara's eyes hardened. "Watch your tone." "No," Melissa snapped. "I've watched my tone for years. I've kept quiet. I trusted you, but you lied. Both of you." Clara folded her arms. "We're trying to hold the family together. That loan is temporary." Melissa's voice cracked. "Is that what you told Dad when you promised to take care of the store if anything ever happened to him?" Clara didn't answer. The silence between them was louder than the storm building outside. Melissa stared at her mother, the woman who used to braid her hair before school, who held her when she cried over scraped knees, who once whispered, "I'll always protect you." Now that woman looked like a stranger? Melissa turned without another word, the statement still clutched in her fist. The first crack had appeared, and she could feel the whole damn house starting to split. Melissa didn't sleep that night. She lay in bed, fully dressed, still wearing the same jeans she'd worked in all day, her eyes fixed on the ceiling as the shadows from passing cars danced across the peeling paint. Her hands were folded over her chest like armor. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Alex stepping out of that car, heard her mother's flat voice saying, "Operating expenses. You know how things are." But it was the silence afterward that haunted her most. They didn't even try to deny it. By 6:17 a.m., Melissa was at the kitchen table with her laptop open, 3 cups of black coffee cold beside her, and a notebook full of half-legible notes scrawled in different colors. She had never considered herself a detective. She didn't have the time or the privilege to be curious. For years, her job had been survival, keep the lights on, keep the shelves stocked, keep breathing. But now she was angry. She clicked through old emails, financial records, scanned receipts, and PDF statements. Things she used to skim through on autopilot now came into focus like a photograph sharpening under developing fluid. There were gaps, withdrawals. She never made approvals. She never signed vendors. She never contacted. She pulled up the online business account, her fingers flying across the keyboard. The interface was simple, but the audit trail wasn't. Dozens of transactions over the past 6 months had been approved under joint account authorization. One name kept appearing: C. Carter. Clara. Melissa's stomach dropped. She paused, then opened a new tab. With her hair tied back, wearing a hoodie that still smelled faintly of coffee grounds, she dialed the customer service number for the bank listed on the latest statement. Her voice was calm, too calm. Its evenness came not from peace, but from tightly coiled tension. "Thank you for calling Bensfield Commercial Lending. How can I assist you today?" "Hi, this is she." Hesitated just a beat. Then her voice shifted, casual but confident. "This is Cheryl Briggs. I'm calling on behalf of Carter's Market. We're reviewing our account activity and I need to confirm some loan details." "Sure, Cheryl. Can I get your customer ID or the loan reference number?" Melissa read it off the document she'd printed and scribbled with red ink. "Thanks. Give me just a moment." "Okay, I'm seeing an active loan taken out on March 2nd. Amount disbursed $25,000. Account registered under Carter's Market LLC. Authorized signers, Clara Carter and Alexander Carter. The words hit her like bricks stacked on her chest. "Wait," she said, trying to keep her voice level. "Alexander Carter. That can't be right. I thought Clara was the sole signer." Another pause. "No, ma'am. Alexander is listed as a co-signer. He submitted supplemental documents showing ownership stake in the business. The paperwork was processed in office." Melissa's hand clenched around the phone. "Do you have a copy of those documents on file? I'm afraid I can't share them unless you're an authorized signer." "Of course. She wasn't on that loan. She wasn't on any of them." "Understood," she said, forcing a polite chuckle. "Thanks for the clarification. That was helpful." She ended the call, her heart thudding so loudly she barely heard the dial tone. That afternoon, she went to the storage room, pulled down the old banker's box, where they kept tax returns and lease agreements. She flipped through files with trembling fingers, praying she'd find something to make sense of it all. And then she did. A printed copy of the LLC operating agreement updated version, dated 7 months ago. Melissa's name was absent. Instead, the business listed 2 managing partners, Clara Carter and Alexander Carter. Her breath stopped. She sank into the folding chair beside the shelves, the paper still in her hands, her mind reeling. They had removed her, without her knowledge, without her consent. They had signed papers, filed legal updates, accessed lines of credit, and applied for loans, all while letting her believe she was still part of the core structure, that her backbreaking labor was building something for all of them. But she was just a tool, a workhorse. Melissa's hands trembled as she folded the agreement and tucked it into her hoodie pocket. Later, standing in front of the bathroom mirror at home, she studied her own face like it belonged to someone else. Her eyes were dull, hollowed out by years of overwork. Her jaw was tight. Her lips pressed into a hard, unforgiving line. For the first time, she allowed herself to speak the thought she'd kept buried beneath the busyness, beneath the self-sacrifice and justification and the illusions of loyalty. Did they ever plan to let me go back? It hung in the air like smoke. Did they ever mean to give me my share? The bathroom fan hummed overhead, but otherwise there was no answer. Only silence. And silence had become the most dangerous sound of all. She splashed cold water on her face and dried it with the same towel she'd used for days. Then she went to her room and opened her notebook. On the first clean page, she wrote in large, deliberate letters, "What I know." And underneath, "Alex is legally a co-owner. Clara is co-signer on at least 2 loans. My name has been removed from the LLC. They accessed the line of credit using the business. I was never informed. I was never asked. They let me believe I was still part of it." She paused, then added a final line. This was never a mistake. The pen hovered for a second more before she underlined it twice. It hadn't happened overnight. It wasn't a single slip or a bad decision made in panic. This was premeditated. Paper trails, legal updates, reassignments, months of quiet maneuvering while she worked the register and scrubbed the floors and tried to convince herself that struggle meant progress. But it hadn't been progress. It had been exploitation dressed as duty. And now as she stared down the truth she'd gathered on her own, Melissa felt something shift deep in her chest. Not fear. Not even sadness. It was steel. They'd built a cage for her out of guilt and family obligation. But they forgot something. Melissa Carter had learned to survive in silence. And now, she was learning how to fight. Melissa didn't scream. She didn't throw a fit or punch holes in the walls or storm into the store demanding answers with fists clenched and spit flying. That's not how she worked. No Melissa Carter waged war the way a glacier carved valleys. Slow, quiet, and absolutely irreversible. By the next morning, the mask was already back on. She showed up at the store like nothing had happened. Sorted invoices, stocked shelves, smiled at customers, nodded politely at Clara's usual mid-afternoon arrival in her luxury SUV, fresh from her latest meeting which always smelled suspiciously like eucalyptus massage oil. To anyone looking from the outside, Melissa was still the obedient daughter who never made trouble. But inside her chest something had split wide open, and the only thing left behind was strategy. She made her first move that Friday. A quiet dinner at a hole-in-the-wall Thai place with Ava Martinez, her old roommate from undergrad, a political science major turned freelance legal consultant. They hadn't spoken in almost a year. Ava walked in late heels, clicking hair swept back and eyebrows already raised when she spotted Melissa hunched over a stack of napkins covered in notes. "You look like someone just buried your future," Ava said, sitting down. Melissa didn't blink. They did. 10 minutes later, Ava had the full download, the erased LLC paperwork, the backdoor loans, the false promises, and Melissa's slow dawning realization that her own mother and brother had methodically cut her out of the family business while using her to keep it alive. Ava's voice dropped low. "Do you want revenge or results?" Melissa looked up, eyes steady. "Both. By Monday, the paperwork for a new business entity had been filed Northern Elm Acquisitions LLC, registered under Ava's name, silent partner Melissa. It was a shell company, clean, quiet, unremarkable. The kind of entity that blended into the noise of small-town commerce. Just another holding company easily forgotten. But Melissa had one very specific purpose for it. Carter's Market wasn't fully owned by Clara and Alex, not technically. Years ago, when her father expanded operations, he'd handed out small percentages to extended family members, 5% here, 2% there, as a way to show gratitude and tie them to the store's legacy. Most of them never participated in management or decision-making. Over time, they'd forgotten the shares even existed. Melissa hadn't. So she made a list. Uncle Gary, 3%, Aunt Lynn, 2%, Cousin Deborah, 4%, Great Aunt Norma, 1.5%. 12 relatives in total, none with more than 5%, but together they held over 20% of the business. Enough to swing a vote, enough to own a voice, enough to threaten Clara's control. One by one, Melissa reached out, but not as herself. Through Northern Elm, she offered to purchase their shares at a premium, discreet, no questions asked. The kind of email that looked like a routine market buyout from an anonymous investor who wanted a foothold in the local retail scene. Most said yes immediately. Some didn't even ask the price. They were tired of the mess. They didn't care about the legacy anymore. Carter's Market had become a footnote in their lives. They were happy to be rid of it. Within 6 weeks, Melissa, through her shell company, controlled 19.6% of the business. And no one had noticed. Step 2, lawyering up. She found someone downtown, Mark Latimer. Mid-40s Harvard law grad, dressed like he lived in his office. No nonsense, discreet, borderline paranoid. Perfect. Their first meeting was brief. Why the secrecy, he asked, glancing over the thick file Melissa handed him. Because the people I am investigating are my family, she said plainly. He didn't blink, just flipped open the manila folder and started reading. At night, Melissa became an archivist of betrayal. She began recording every conversation with Clara. Using a voice memo app disguised as a calculator, she'd catch snippets over dinner during phone calls, even in passing hallway exchanges. You know how hard it is to run a business? Honey Clara would say while swirling wine in her glass. We do what we have to do. Sometimes that means moving money around without getting stuck in paperwork. Click, saved. Alex is going to take over eventually. It makes sense for him to start making financial decisions. Click, saved. When Clara slipped one day and mentioned a wire transfer Melissa hadn't been told about, Melissa smiled and nodded, voice sweet, hand steady as she tapped the screen in her pocket. Click, saved. She took pictures too. Invoices with forged signatures. Loan statements with backdated entries. Delivery receipts for items that never arrived. Even Clara's credit card statements left out once on the kitchen table showing spa visits, jewelry purchases, and a weekend getaway to Tahoe. All within the same billing cycle where Clara had claimed they were barely staying afloat. She created a map, a literal hand-drawn map on butcher paper that took up the entire wall of her bedroom. Red yarn connected names to dates, documents to accounts. At the center of it all was a single word written in block letters. Intention. This wasn't accidental. It wasn't desperation. It was calculated. They'd fed her promises while carving her out of the future they were building for themselves. Her labor had been the foundation, but her name was nowhere in the blueprints. One night, she walked into the store early hours before opening. She turned on the lights, walked to the center of the floor, closed her eyes. She could still see her father stocking shelves here, humming old country songs, tossing her a roll of price stickers like a football. She could still hear him laughing with customers telling her, "This place is more than a store, kid. It's a promise, a handshake with the community." She opened her eyes. That promise was gone now, but there was something new in its place. Resolve. Melissa didn't know yet how or when the confrontation would happen, but she knew it was no longer a question of if. It was just a matter of how hard they'd fall when she pulled the last string. The rain was soft at first, just a whisper against the window pane. Melissa stood in the kitchen elbows, resting on the counter, watching the drops streak down the glass like tears she didn't have time to shed. The store was closed for the evening. The shelves were stocked, the register balanced. Her hands still smelled faintly of sanitizer and metal from counting coins. She hadn't planned this conversation, not really, but it had been rising in her throat for weeks now, hot and bitter, ready to burn its way out. Clara breezed in through the side door, a gust of expensive perfume preceding her. She peeled off her coat like a debutante coming home from a gala, heels tapping across the floor, phone glowing in her hand. "You left the front light on," she said absently, not even glancing up. Melissa didn't move. "We need to talk." Clara paused a sigh curling in her chest. Melissa, if this is about the inventory audit again, I told you I don't. It's not, Melissa interrupted, turning slowly to face her. This is about something else. Clara raised an eyebrow. All right then, what is it? Melissa reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded sheet of paper, one of the shareholder documents she'd quietly acquired. She didn't hand it over. She didn't need to. If the store were mine, Melissa said carefully, each word sharp and deliberate. If tomorrow I owned it completely, what would you do? Clara blinked the question, catching her off guard. Excuse me? Melissa didn't waver. If everything here, the license, the brand, the land, the accounts belong to me, not a share left for Alex, nothing in your name, just me. A beat of silence. Then Clara let out a quiet, dry laugh. What kind of ridiculous question is that? It's not, Melissa said. Answer me. If the store was mine, would you stand by me? Clara stared, the smile draining from her lips. She walked slowly to the counter, poured herself a glass of mineral water like she needed something to ground her. I've done everything for this family, she said softly. You think you're the only one who's sacrificed? That's not an answer. Clara turned, arms crossed. What exactly are you trying to prove? Melissa stepped closer, voice trembling. I just want to know, Mom. When it's me or him, when it's the truth or your version of it, whose side are you on? Clara didn't flinch, didn't look away. Instead, she said it. Flat, cold, unforgiving. You were never the one I put my faith in. The words sliced through Melissa's chest like glass. Clara's voice was calm, matter-of-fact, as if she were reading off a grocery list. Alex has vision. He thinks big. He's bold. He makes mistakes, yes, but he doesn't freeze every time someone expects something of him. You're safe. Practical. You do what you're told, but that's not leadership, Melissa. That's obedience. Melissa blinked as if trying to clear her vision. The room was suddenly too bright, the air too thick. I gave up school, she said, voice barely above a whisper. I gave up everything. You asked me to save this place, and I did. Clara tilted her head. And you should be proud of that. But don't confuse hard work with value. The glass in Melissa's hand nearly slipped. Clara sighed again as if exhausted by the weight of the conversation. You think this is betrayal, but this is business. If Alex takes over, we grow. If you take over, we survive. There's a difference. Melissa shook her head slowly. You think survival is weakness? I think survival is what I expect from you, Clara replied. You always survive. Alex, he needs help. He needs guidance. So you gave him mine, Melissa snapped, voice cracking now. My money, my hours, my back, my time. You handed all of that to him like it didn't cost me anything. Clara's lips pressed into a thin line. This conversation is over. But it wasn't. Not for Melissa. She stared at the woman in front of her. Not the mother who kissed skinned knees or sewed Halloween costumes by hand, but the stranger who could watch her daughter break and still find a way to justify the crack. Clara moved to leave. Melissa stepped aside, letting her pass. Her hands curled into fists as she whispered, You already chose your side. Clara paused in the doorway. And so will you. Someday when you have children, you'll understand. Melissa didn't reply. The door clicked shut. The rain had grown heavier. Melissa stepped outside, the cold wind biting against her cheeks. She didn't bother with a coat. She walked down the narrow sidewalk beside the store, past the dumpster, past the flickering street lamp that hadn't worked properly in months. She reached the edge of the lot and stopped, her breath clouding in front of her. The rain soaked through her clothes in minutes. Her hair clung to her face. Her fingers trembled from something deeper than the cold. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, smearing water and dust across her skin. There was dirt on her palm from the register drawer, from the delivery bins, from the basement she'd cleaned that morning, after the sump pump backed up. The kind of grime you couldn't wash off in one go. The kind that lived in your skin, in your bones. Money dust. That's what her dad used to call it. He'd come home with it on his shirt and say, You know it's a good day when you're covered in money dust. But Melissa didn't feel rich. She felt robbed. By blood, by love, by loyalty used like rope around her neck. She sat on the curb, knees drawn to her chest, and let herself cry, not loud, not messy, but in the quiet, silent way that people cry when they realize the person they've been defending was always the one holding the knife. You were never the one I put my faith in. Not Alex. Not the bank. Not the strangers. Her mother. Her mother had always been the enemy hiding in plain sight. And now Melissa wasn't just alone in the rain. She was alone in the truth. But she wouldn't be alone forever. Because now she had a plan. And Clara had made one mistake too many. Melissa always knew Alex would run. She just didn't know how far. It started with a scent something expensive and out of place, a musky cologne that clung to the break room air like arrogance in liquid form. Melissa had smelled it before. Not in Carter's Market, but in passing department stores, elevator rides, Instagram ads that popped up after you searched for anything executive. It didn't belong in their store. But Alex did. He strolled in like he owned the air around him, phone in one hand, Starbucks cup in the other, wearing a button-down that still had the folds from being fresh out the box. "Morning, sis," he said, grinning. "Don't mind me just picking up the mail." Melissa narrowed her eyes as she restocked the impulse buy gum rack. "You haven't shown up in 3 weeks. Now you care about the mail." Alex opened the drawer behind the register, rifling through envelopes. "I'm working on something. Big deal. Overseas partnership. Might even take a few months off once it's done." "Overseas?" she repeated. "Since when do we do overseas?" Alex didn't answer. He just smirked, tucked 2 manila envelopes into his coat, and breezed back out like the place bored him. Like the store the one their father built was a waiting room before his real life began. That night, Melissa sat on the floor of her room, laptop balanced on a plastic crate, a spreadsheet open in one window, and Alex's Instagram profile in another. She'd never paid close attention to his social media before, couldn't stomach the shallow flexes and motivational captions that always made her feel like she was the villain in a success story that had nothing to do with reality. But this time she scrolled, and there it was, a boomerang video, champagne glasses clinking against a blurred Eiffel Tower souvenir. The caption read, "Paris next week. Time to live big. You only get one shot, right? Had jet set, and level up." The comments were flooded with fire emojis and empty praise from girls who called him king. One comment from his girlfriend Lena read, "So proud of you, babe. We deserve this." Melissa stared at the screen, the glow casting shadows under her eyes. A sickening clarity bloomed in her chest. He was leaving, and not just for a vacation. No, this was something else. Something final. She called Ava the next morning, her voice low and taut. "He's making a move." Ava didn't need clarification. "What did you find?" "He's leaving for Paris. Lena's going too. Long trip, no return date." A pause. "Do you think he's running?" Melissa inhaled. "I think he's cashing out." Ava cursed under her breath. "You need to get ahead of this." "I'm trying," Melissa said. "But I need access to the store's real estate agreements. I think he's trying to sell." Ava exhaled slowly. "You have to prove it." Melissa nodded. "I will." By the afternoon, she was deep in the back office of Carter's Market, digging through dusty filing cabinets the way some people dig for bones. And there it was, stuffed between expired warranties and a Christmas card from 2013, the lease contract and property deed. But what made her pulse spike was the addendum stapled carelessly behind it. Authorization of sale in absence of full shareholder vote, signed by Clara and Alex, dated 6 weeks ago. It was legal language dressed up to look benign, but Melissa knew exactly what it meant. They could sell, and they didn't need her to do it. The phone call came that evening. Melissa was on her way to the store's back entrance when her phone buzzed in her jacket pocket. Unknown number. She hesitated, then picked up. "Hi," a male voice said smoothly. "Is this Melissa Carter?" She didn't answer right away. "This is Daniel Rooks. I represent a private investment group interested in acquiring regional assets in your area. I believe your family business may be among them. Would you be available to discuss the current valuation of Carter's Market?" Melissa stopped walking. "Where did you get my number?" A pause. "It was provided by Mr. Carter." "Alex Carter." Her fingers clenched around the phone. "Mr. Rooks," she said slowly. "Is this a formal inquiry?" "Not yet," he replied. "But we're moving quickly. We've reviewed the property and financial history. There's significant interest. In fact, your brother mentioned the possibility of closing before he leaves the country." Melissa swallowed the bile rising in her throat. "How much is he asking?" Frankly, Rooks chuckled. "Far below market. But we're not complaining." Melissa's voice dropped to ice. "Don't do anything until you hear from me again." Click! She stood there, breath-shallow heartbeat thudding in her ears like war drums. He was selling, not just leaving. He was offloading the business at a bargain to stuff his pockets before disappearing. Alex was trying to burn the whole thing down and fly first class through the smoke. She spent the next hour in the back alley, pacing under the flickering lamplight, fingers flying across her phone. Texts to Ava, notes in her private document folder, audio memos to herself. "I need to freeze the sale, or delay it, or expose it before the transfer goes through." She replayed every conversation she'd had with Alex in the past month, every smirk, every time he brushed her off, every time he acted like the store was a dying animal he didn't mind putting down. A plan began to form, but more than that, a deadline. Melissa realized she had days, maybe less, This wasn't about some distant confrontation anymore. This wasn't a chess game. It was a fuse, and Alex had already lit it. Now she had to beat the flame. Back home, she pulled out her father's old ledger. It was worn leather, the corners frayed pages, yellowed from time. He used to keep everything in it, numbers, notes, even little mantras to stay focused. On the inside cover, written in his tight, precise handwriting, were the words, "You don't protect something by running from it. You protect it by standing in front of it." Melissa closed the book, placed it beside her laptop, and opened a blank document. The title read, "Operation Hold the Line." The first line she typed underneath, "Stop the sale, no matter what it costs." The Carter living room hadn't changed since the funeral. Same tan carpet, same dusty photo frames lining the mantel, same crooked lamp in the corner flickering like it didn't know how to quit. The air smelled of roast beef and melted candles thick with tradition and the kind of tension only blood ties could cultivate. It was their father's death anniversary, 1 year to the day. The family had gathered out of obligation, buttoned-up uncles with sagging waistlines, aunts with wine glasses, perpetually half-full cousins, clumped together near the snack table, texting under the guise of polite attention. No one came for healing. They came because guilt did strange things to people when grief was involved. Melissa stood in the corner near the window, arms folded, her back straight as steel. Her laptop sat on the end table beside her, closed for now. But inside it waited the kind of truth that couldn't be untold. She'd worn black not for mourning but for war. Clara floated from guest to guest like a politician before an election. Polished, poised, her lips curved into a maternal smile that fooled the entire room. "We're just so grateful to have everyone here," she said more than once. "This family is everything to us." Melissa watched her with the kind of stillness that wasn't passive. It was loaded, like a wire pulled so tight it could cut. And then Alex arrived. Late, of course. Tan from his pre-Paris getaway sunglasses perched on his head like a crown, Lena trailing behind him in a silk blouse and heels too loud for the carpet. Melissa didn't move. She waited. Waited until everyone was seated. Plates full, drinks in hand, conversations rising and falling in easy waves. Then she stepped forward. "Before we eat," she said calmly, raising her voice just enough to slice through the chatter, "I'd like to say a few words. About Dad." Chairs shifted. Forks paused midair. A few murmurs of assent. Clara nodded, though her smile looked thinner now. Melissa reached down, opened the laptop, and plugged in the small USB drive she'd kept in her coat pocket like a blade. The TV mounted above the fireplace flickered to life. "I've spent the last few months trying to hold this store, this family together," Melissa said, her voice clear, steady. "And while I was working overtime, skipping meals, and patching up holes in the ceiling, others were making different choices." She clicked the first file. A spreadsheet filled the screen, names of banks, loan amounts, approval dates. Melissa highlighted a column labeled Authorization Signatures. At the bottom, Clara Carter, Alexander Carter, repeated, again and again. "These are the loans taken out under Carter's market in the last 10 months. Over $80,000 in debt. Signed without my knowledge, without my consent." The room fell silent. Melissa clicked again. An image appeared, a copy of the updated LLC agreement. Clara and Alex's signatures were circled in red. 7 months ago, the business was restructured. I was removed. They filed it quietly without even a conversation. I stopped being an owner that day. I just didn't know it. Clara stood abruptly. "Melissa, this isn't—" Melissa held up a hand. "I'm not finished." Another click. This time, a side-by-side comparison, the store's valuation report and a purchase offer document from Daniel Rooks's firm dated 3 days ago. The number on the offer was tens of thousands below market value. They were preparing to sell Carter's market for a fraction of its worth, to cash out. Alex has already bought tickets to Paris. This wasn't a business decision. It was an exit strategy. All eyes turned to Alex, who looked pale despite his tan. "You told me Uncle Gary began," but Alex shook his head. It wasn't like that. Melissa clicked again. This time, a voice recording. Clara's voice clear and unmistakable. "Alex is going to take over eventually. It makes sense for him to start making financial decisions." Then another. "Sometimes that means moving money around without getting stuck in paperwork." The silence that followed was suffocating. Clara sat down slowly, her face frozen as if she hadn't decided yet whether to deny or deflect. Melissa looked around the room. "You all invested in this store in one way or another. Some of you hold shares. Some of you lent your name to Dad's vision. You deserve to know how that legacy was used and who tried to bury it." Her eyes met every set of widened eyes. Aunts and uncles, cousins, Even Great Aunt Norma, who hadn't spoken aloud since the Obama administration, looked stunned. Melissa shut the laptop. For a long time, I believed in loyalty above everything. I worked in silence. I trusted the people who told me they loved me. But love without respect isn't love. It's leverage. Alex's voice cracked. Melissa, this isn't what it looks like. No, she asked quietly. He stood up. You don't understand. I had plans. Real plans. You were always so small-minded. I was always in your way, Melissa said, cutting him off. That's why you had to erase me from the paperwork. That's why you needed Mom's signature instead of mine, because I would have said no. Clara finally found her voice. This is family. You're airing this in front of everyone. We could have talked. We did talk, Melissa snapped. You just didn't listen. She looked at them both. Dad trusted you. I did too. And you used that trust to rob us all. No one moved. The only sound was the low hum of the fridge in the adjoining kitchen. Finally, Aunt Lynn whispered, Is this all true? Melissa nodded. Clara looked like she might speak again, but said nothing. Alex's face was blank, like he was still trying to find the right angle, the right lie. But there was nothing left to spin. Melissa stepped back. Let the silence stretch. Let it land. She didn't need to yell. The truth was loud enough. The front door creaked open with a sharp, deliberate sound. Heads turned. Conversations froze mid-sentence. The hum of disbelief that had filled the room just minutes before fell dead in the air like a switch had been flipped. Even the fireplace crackled a little softer, as if it too sensed what was coming. Mark Latimer stepped inside umbrella, still dripping rain onto the carpet, his suit dry and crisp despite the storm outside. He carried a black leather briefcase in one hand and a folded piece of paper in the other. The moment his shoes touched the rug, the balance of the room shifted. Melissa didn't move. She stood near the fireplace, one hand resting gently on the closed laptop that had just detonated the quiet illusion of Carter family unity. Her eyes followed Mark across the living room as he stepped toward her, not a word exchanged, then turned to face the room. Ladies and gentlemen, Mark began, voice calm but carrying. My name is Mark Latimer, legal representative for Ms. Melissa Carter. I am here to deliver a certified statement regarding ownership and control of Carter's Market LLC. Clara stood up, voice sharp and brittle. This is a family gathering? Then it's the perfect time, Mark replied unbothered. No better audience? He opened the folder and unfolded the paper slowly, like peeling back the final layer of pretense. As of 31 days ago, Melissa Carter, through Northern Elm Acquisitions LLC, successfully purchased and consolidated all remaining minority shares of Carter's Market totaling 22.4%. He looked up briefly, letting that number land. When added to her previous silent holdings, Ms. Carter now owns 100% of the business. A wave of stunned silence passed over the room like a shiver. Alex froze mid-step halfway to the bar cart. That's not possible, he muttered. Mark raised an eyebrow. It's not only possible, it's documented. These documents were filed and confirmed through the county clerk's office and the Secretary of State's business portal. And as of today, Melissa Carter is the sole legal owner of Carter's Market LLC. He turned slightly toward her, offering the original copy, signed, sealed, and notarized. Melissa took it with steady hands. Her chest rose and fell once, deep, quiet. It wasn't victory that passed through her in that moment. It was release. The weight of years of unpaid debts of invisible labor finally falling from her shoulders. No smile, no triumph, just air, clean and unburdened. Clara looked stunned. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. You bought out your family, she whispered. You turned them into strangers on paper. Melissa met her gaze with eerie calm. You turned me into one first. Mark wasn't done. And he continued upon review of recent financial activity tied to Carter's Market, as well as the fraudulent loan applications and falsified authorizations. I've submitted a full report to the local authorities. Alex scoffed. You think a few loans are enough to bring the cops? This is a business. You don't understand how deals work. Mark didn't flinch. No, he said. But I do understand how federal law works. Specifically, Title 18 U.S. Code VAR 114, making false statements to a lending institution. And under that, what you've done isn't just unethical, it's criminal. The front door burst open again. This time it wasn't a lawyer. It was two uniformed officers, calm, purposeful. One of them carried a folder, the other had cuffs. Alexander Carter, the taller one, asked, stepping forward. Alex blinked. What the hell? You're under arrest for financial fraud, identity misrepresentation, and misuse of business credit lines totaling over $85,000. They read him his rights, word by word. No one moved, not even Clara. Not even Lena, who stood pale and shaking behind the couch, her manicured fingers covering her mouth. Alex looked at Melissa wild-eyed. You did this? Melissa held his gaze. No, you did. The officers guided him out without a struggle, though his mouth kept moving unspoken arguments, unfinished excuses, words that no longer held currency in this room. After the door clicked shut, silence swallowed the room whole. Mark turned to Melissa. Would you like to address the ownership transfer formally? Melissa shook her head. No need. Mark gave her a curt nod, closed the briefcase, and quietly slipped away, leaving behind nothing but truth and paperwork. Melissa turned to face her family. Her real family. The ones who were left. No one met her eyes. Clara sat down slowly on the couch, staring into nothing, her wineglass untouched. Her shoulders hunched, not in grief, but in something worse, exposure. Melissa didn't gloat. She didn't raise her voice or quote legalese or revel in Alex's arrest. She just stood there, shoulders back, chin level. Free? For the first time in years, the weight was no longer hers to carry. She hadn't burned bridges. She had simply shown them for what they were already ash. She exhaled once slow and deep, then turned away from the room that had once tried to bury her alive, and walked into the rest of her life. The sound of the handcuffs hadn't even faded when Clara fell to her knees. It didn't happen with drama. No gasping sob, no theatrical collapse. She just lowered herself, slowly, carefully, like someone who knew the exact weight of what was about to come crashing down and wanted to brace before it flattened her. Her knees touched the living room carpet, the same one Melissa used to sit on as a child, building Lego cities her mother never noticed. Now Clara knelt in the ruins. Tears streaked her carefully powdered face, the foundation breaking in patches along her cheekbones. Her lipstick was smudged, her hands trembling not from age but from fear. Raw, unfiltered fear. Melissa, she breathed, voice cracked like glass. Please. Melissa didn't speak. Clara crawled forward slightly. Hands outstretched like she might grab hold of something invisible between them. History, maybe. Memory. I was wrong, she said louder now, the desperation bubbling up. I see that now. I didn't mean for it to go this far. Melissa looked down at her, one brow raised ever so slightly. Not cruel, not angry. Just done. Clara pressed a hand to her own chest, breath hitching. I was trying to protect your brother. He's always been fragile, you know that. Fragile, Melissa said, voice cold and quiet. He was wearing a Rolex while I was rationing groceries. Clara flinched. Her shoulders shook. I thought if we could just get through this rough patch, if we could sell and start over, it would all make sense later. We'd make it right. I swear to you I was going to fix it. Melissa crossed her arms. With what another lie? Clara reached out again, eyes wide and glistening. You don't understand what it's like. To be a mother. You'd do anything to keep your children safe. Melissa didn't move. You left me hungry, Mom, she said, her voice low, steady but sharp enough to slice bone. You watched me come home with cracked hands and tired eyes. You watched me carry that store on my back while you funneled every dollar into Alex's next mistake. And you told yourself it was love. Clara's voice broke. I didn't know how else to keep him together. Then let him fall, Melissa snapped. You let me fall, every single day. Silence. Then softer but sharper than any scream, Melissa whispered, no one starves their child like a mother who's pretending she doesn't see them. The words hit harder than the cuffs. Clara folded into herself, sobs shaking her frame. But Melissa didn't kneel beside her. She didn't comfort. She didn't touch. She simply turned away. That evening, Carter's Market closed for the last time. There was no announcement, no banner, no fond farewell letter posted to the front window. Just silence. The last customers had come and gone, oblivious to the storm that had raged behind the checkout counter for years. The shelves were mostly empty now, the familiar smell of disinfectant lingering in the air like something unresolved. Melissa stood outside the glass doors, key in hand, her breath fogging the pane as the sun dipped low behind the neighboring buildings. The sign above the door, Carter's Market St. 1982, hung crooked. She stared at it for a long time, then stepped forward. With one firm tug, she pulled the cord that loosened the sign from its brackets. The old wood creaked as it gave way, landing in her arms with a soft thud. She rested it against the wall, brushed a speck of rust from the corner. The last piece of her father's dream, or maybe the last illusion of it. Behind her, the orange of sunset bled across the parking lot. The light turned the asphalt gold, turned the windows of the store into mirrors. For a moment, Melissa saw herself reflected in the glass, older now, sharper, quieter. Not broken, just remade. She locked the door for the last time. No ceremony, no key left under the mat. Just a woman walking away from a battlefield that used to be home. And for the first time, no one was watching her leave. No one was asking her to stay. No one was rewriting the story in real time to make themselves the hero. Only silence. The real kind. The honest kind. The kind you earn when you stop begging to be seen and finally see yourself. The paint still smelled fresh. Not overwhelming, just enough to remind her that this place had changed. Melissa stood in the center of what used to be Carter's Market, barefoot on new hardwood floors that gleamed like honey under the morning sun. The old tiles had been torn up 2 weeks ago, the flickering fluorescent lights replaced by warm pendant fixtures that cast soft circles of gold across the room. The humming fridges were gone, the register dismantled. The faded wire racks that once held soup cans and discount cereal now sat in the alley behind the building, rusting beneath spring rain. She'd kept the space open, airy. A few tables, mismatched chairs, bookshelves lining the walls like quiet guardians. The scent of coffee wafted in from the back, blending with the subtle hint of paper and oak. It wasn't a store anymore. It was a promise rebuilt. The paperwork had gone through a month ago. Melissa Carter, sole owner of the property at 118 Brookfield Avenue. No shell company this time, no legal disguise, just her name printed clearly across the top of the deed in black ink that felt like justice. The renovation had taken every dollar she'd saved, but she hadn't flinched, because this place was no longer about obligation. It was about choice. Behind the counter, framed in walnut and glass, hung a photo. Her father, laughing, elbows deep in a stockroom repair shirt, sleeves rolled, a wrench in one hand, and a smudge of oil across his cheek. He wasn't posing. Someone had caught him mid-sentence, mid-motion. The kind of moment most people forget. The kind of moment Melissa had held on to like breath underwater. She'd spent a long time deciding where to put that photo, and in the end it had to be there, centered behind the counter, right where he used to stand when she was a little girl, sneaking candy bars into her pocket, grinning like she was slick. She stared at the photo now. "It's yours too," she whispered. The front bell jingled. Her heart skipped just slightly. That sound hadn't changed. She'd kept the bell. It had hung above the door since 1982, and despite everything, it still rang with the same soft charm. A woman stepped inside, mid-30s, holding the hand of a small boy with round glasses and a backpack twice his size. They paused in the doorway, eyes wide. Melissa smiled. "Hi," she said, gently stepping from behind the counter. "Welcome to the Elm Room." The woman smiled back. "We weren't sure if you were open yet." Melissa nodded. "You're my first." The little boy let go of his mother's hand and wandered toward the nearest shelf, running his fingers across the spines of the books like they were made of silk. Melissa watched him, not the way a shopkeeper watches for messes, the way a gardener watches the first seed push through soil. They stayed for 30 minutes. The boy curled up in the reading nook, flipping through a picture book with pirates on the cover. His mother sipped the complimentary tea Melissa had nervously set out that morning, unsure if anyone would even walk through the door. When they left, the boy waved. Melissa waved back. The bell rang again, soft as breath. She stood alone again, hand still raised, watching the door close slowly on its hinges. And then she whispered the words she had practiced for weeks, words that had once tasted too big in her mouth, too theatrical, but now they felt true. Welcome to freedom. Not just for them, for her. Outside, the sign over the door swayed gently in the breeze. The Elm Room. Books, stories, shelter. No mention of groceries, no family name, no ghosts. Just Melissa. And the next chapter written on her own terms. The rain that night came down in long, slanting sheets, soaking the sidewalk in silence. Inside the Elm Room, Melissa moved slowly through the space, straightening the edge of a tablecloth, here adjusting the angle of a lamp there. The shop had been closed for nearly an hour, but she hadn't turned off the lights yet. There was something about the storm that made the quiet feel different. Not heavy, not haunted, just still. Outside, the town had folded into itself. Cars hissed by like whispers, the gutters gurgled softly, and the front windows of the shop blurred with streaks of water, turning the world beyond them into a watercolor of shadows and lights. She was placing a new poetry volume on the center table when she noticed it. A shape, still familiar. Clara, standing on the sidewalk just outside the window. Umbrella clutched tight, coat wrapped high around her neck, mascara running slightly in the rain. She didn't knock, didn't call out, just stood there. Melissa's breath caught, not in fear, not in panic, in memory. For one long second, she said nothing, did nothing. Then she walked to the counter, opened the pastry case, and pulled out a single lemon tart, the kind her mother used to crave on late Sundays, the kind Melissa had learned to make by watching her bake them once a year, always humming the same song. She placed the tart carefully on a white ceramic plate, covered it with plastic wrap, and carried it to the front of the store. Then, without looking outside, she unlocked the side door leading to the alley, stepped into the rain, and placed the plate gently on the wooden display shelf behind the glass just inside the window. A quiet offering. Nothing more. Then she stepped back inside. Clara was still standing there. She saw it. The tart. Her mouth parted slightly. Her fingers flexed around the umbrella handle. Melissa walked back toward the counter. Not in haste, not with finality, just calm, grounded steps. She turned off the front lights one by one until only the warm glow from the back room remained, casting a soft amber light on the photo of her father above the register. When she finally looked back toward the window, Clara was gone. Only the tart remained, unclaimed, untouched. Melissa didn't move to retrieve it. She didn't cry. She didn't ache. She simply stood there, her hand resting gently on the countertop, eyes soft, heart still. Forgiveness wasn't required, but the hate had left her. She wasn't waiting for a knock anymore, and she wasn't waiting to be seen. She had chosen her peace, and peace, she learned, did not ask for permission. It simply arrived quiet and full of rain. The sun hadn't risen yet, but Melissa was already awake. Not out of anxiety, not because something was wrong, but because her body, after years of strain and survival, had finally relearned what it meant to wake up without dread sitting on her chest. She moved quietly through her small apartment above the shop barefoot on the cool tile, wrapping herself in a thick gray cardigan. The sound of her footsteps was steady, grounded. No more rushing, no more panic, just presence. Downstairs, the elm room waited in darkness, but the kind that felt like rest, not abandonment. Melissa turned on the lights one by one, illuminating the space slowly, like coaxing open a dream you want to last a little longer. The scent of old pages and wood polish greeted her first. Then came the ritual. She measured the coffee beans, fresh, rich, aromatic, and ground them slowly. The whir of the machine breaking the quiet just enough to remind her she was alive. She moved behind the counter like she had for years, but everything was different now. No receipts to juggle, no inventory nightmares, no bank calls about overdue invoices. Just a clean counter, a quiet room, and a warm cup of truth brewing in her hands. At 7:00 a.m., she unlocked the door. Rain had passed during the night, leaving the sidewalk slick with dew and the air crisp enough to keep your breath close. She stepped outside with a small chalkboard sign writing in careful script, "Books are free, peace is welcome, coffee's on the house until 10. Then she returned inside, flipped the open sign with a tap of her finger, and exhaled. It didn't take long. A young girl wandered in first, barely 16, backpack sagging under the weight of something heavier than textbooks. She didn't say much, just nodded, and made her way to a corner shelf, fingers lingering over a worn copy of Their Eyes Were Watching God. Then came 2 college students, boy and girl, clearly not a couple, but bonded by shared exhaustion. They ordered coffee out of habit, blinking when Melissa waved them off. "Free this morning," she said softly. "Go find something that makes you forget your schedule." They did. By 8:30, the elm room was humming not with commerce but with breath. Quiet readers in corners, friends whispering over dog-eared poetry, the kettle whistling now and again. No rush, no noise, just motion without pressure. Melissa sat on the tall stool behind the counter watching. Not managing, not guarding, just witnessing. She thought about the girl she used to be, the one who poured coffee until her hands bled, who skipped meals and sleep to keep a lie stitched together with loyalty and shame. She'd thought justice would feel loud when it arrived, thunderous and bright like fireworks. But it didn't. It felt like this: stillness, warmth, the sound of pages turning. And then the voice, her own, finally steady, finally sure, rose inside her like narration over film. Revenge was never the victory. Giving myself back to me, that was the release. Outside, the world kept turning. But inside the elm room, for just a few sacred hours, it paused. And Melissa, for once, had nothing to run from, nothing to prove, and nothing to hold but peace. The bell above the door rang softly, followed by the uneven rhythm of small feet hurrying across hardwood. Melissa looked up from the register, not to ring anyone up, not anymore, but simply to observe. The little girl couldn't have been more than 7. Her red coat was soaked at the hem, and her backpack looked like it held more than her frame should be able to carry. She had freckles, round glasses, and the kind of curiosity that lit up a room without asking permission. "Hi," the girl said, breathless. Melissa smiled. "Hi there. Looks like the rain almost caught you." The girl giggled and stepped out of her wet sneakers right by the door without being told. "Do you have books about the moon?" she asked, eyes bright. Melissa chuckled softly. We've got stories about astronauts' star maps and even a book where the moon talks back. Really, the girl whispered, reverent. Really, Melissa said, stepping out from behind the counter. She led the child to the shelf near the back, the one filled with picture books, middle-grade novels, and a few hand-picked treasures she'd placed there herself. Titles her dad once read to her. Titles she used to mouth along with before she even knew the alphabet. As the girl reached up to grab a worn copy of Moonlight and Max, her shoelace caught beneath her boot. She stumbled a little. Melissa was already kneeling. Without hesitation, she crouched down, lifted the hem of the red coat gently, and started to tie the undone laces. The girl blinked. I can do it. I know, Melissa said gently. But may I? The child nodded. There was something trusting in her stillness, something soft. Melissa's fingers moved carefully, loop-wrap pull. As she tightened the knot, a sudden memory flashed behind her eyes. Her father. Kneeling beside her on the grocery store floor, tucking her shoelaces into double knots while the customers filed past them unnoticed. It's not about hurrying, he'd said. It's about making sure you don't trip later. She hadn't remembered that in years. Now it landed in her chest like sunlight through a cracked window. She looked up at the girl, and for a moment it was like time braided past and present together. All set, Melissa said, rising. The child hugged the book to her chest. Can I borrow this? Melissa smiled. You can take it home. Just promise me you'll come back and tell me what you thought. I promise, the girl beamed. My name's Ellie. Well, Ellie, Melissa replied, you just made this morning magic. The child waved, then skipped over to her guardian, who nodded gratefully from the corner, and they left together, the bell tinkling one last time. Melissa stood in the middle of the room for a long moment. Not overwhelmed, just full. She turned slowly, her eyes scanning the shelves, the quiet corners, the little notes people had started leaving on the corkboard by the door. Thanks for the space to breathe. My kid reads now because of you. I come here when the world gets too loud. She hadn't set out to start a community. She'd just wanted peace. But in that pursuit, something had bloomed. On Thursday afternoons, the retired English teacher from down the street hosted poetry readings near the front window. On Saturdays, 2 high schoolers ran a comic book club in the back. The church down the block donated paperbacks every month. A local bakery started dropping off leftover pastries on Fridays, no charge. And there was always someone always sitting by the fireplace with a book in their lap and nowhere urgent to be. Melissa had expected healing to be private, quiet, solo. But the healing had multiplied, grown roots, found voices. The Elm Room wasn't just hers anymore. It belonged to all of them. She walked back behind the counter, picked up a notepad, and scribbled something before she could overthink it. You don't erase the past, but you don't have to repeat it either. She tore the page and pinned it to the corkboard just beneath someone else's scribbled quote. In this place, even silence feels kind. She stepped back and smiled. This was enough. Not revenge. Not a speech. Just one shoelace, one shelf, one small girl believing in the moon again. And the quiet knowledge that her father, wherever he was, would have been proud. The envelope was cream-colored, thick with texture, the kind used for formal thank-you notes or wedding invitations. Melissa held the pen lightly in her hand, pausing above the paper. A cup of Earl Grey sat beside her untouched. Outside, the afternoon sun stretched across the sidewalk like a golden shawl. Inside the Elm Room, it was quiet, between rushes, between shelves, between everything that used to hurt and everything that had slowly learned not to. She hadn't meant to write a letter that day, but something about the silence nudged her toward reflection. Not nostalgia, not regret, just a steady understanding that this chapter was closing and it deserved its last line. 2 weeks ago, Clara moved out of town. No announcement, no fanfare. Just a U-Haul and an unspoken truth everyone had already accepted. Her name no longer carried the kind of weight that could hold her in place. Melissa found out through Ava, who had run into a neighbor of Clara's at the grocery store. Somewhere upstate, she said. Condo, not a house. Alone. She didn't say it with pity. She didn't say it with triumph. Just the tone people use when reporting weather they can't control. Clara's absence was like the closing of a door Melissa hadn't realized was already shut. As for Alex, his trial had moved quickly. The evidence Melissa submitted had been airtight loan documents, forged signatures, manipulated vendor accounts. His lawyers tried to bargain, begged for leniency based on emotional instability and familial pressure, but the judge had been clear. Guilty. Sentenced to 2 years of probation, 5 years of financial restriction and community service. A suspended sentence, yes, but a permanent stain. He could no longer apply for credit serve on boards or conduct business in his own name without pre-approval from the state. Melissa didn't attend the final hearing. She already knew the verdict she needed. Now, sitting in the warmth of her bookstore, she uncapped her pen and began to write. Dear family, it's been a year. A long one. I've thought about how to address everything, and I suppose I've waited until I could do it without shaking. Many of you stood back. Some out of confusion, some out of fear, some out of the terrible comfort of neutrality. I've made my peace with that, but peace is not the same as forgetfulness. I write this not to reopen wounds, but to acknowledge what we all lost, and what I've reclaimed. She paused, eyes scanning her own handwriting. It was steady, neat, older than it used to be. She continued, Clara has left town. I don't know if you've heard. She didn't say goodbye, but maybe she didn't need to. I think some goodbyes are built over time not spoken. And this one was already built. Alex has been sentenced. The court gave him what it deemed fair. I've given him nothing. Not hate, not love, not anger, just nothing. She reached for her tea, now took a small sip, then returned to the page. I'm still here. The Elm Room is growing. We've started a story hour on Saturdays and a youth reading group on Wednesdays. I see versions of myself in the people who come in tired, hopeful searching. I offer them warmth. I offer them space. I offer them books. Not because I am healed, but because I am healing. And here's what I want you to know: with no need for response or validation, I forgive you. Each of you. Not to absolve, but to release. Not to forget, but to reclaim. Forgiveness, I've learned, isn't a pardon. It's an offering I place down and walk away from, and I do so gladly. I wish you all peace, I truly do. But I also wish for myself a future that doesn't require me to dim. So if we cross paths again, I hope you see me as I am now, not as I was when I was bent under the weight of everyone's comfort but my own. With care, Melissa. She folded the letter and placed it into the envelope. She didn't seal it right away. She simply sat with it. There was no revenge in her veins, no bitterness. Only breath, only space, only a life that was finally hers. And outside beyond the window, a child laughed, running with a paper crown and a book clutched to her chest like a secret treasure. Melissa looked up and smiled. This was the ending Clara never saw coming. Melissa had survived, and more than that, she'd returned to herself. The sky was still painted in the soft blues and golds of a morning that hadn't quite committed to being day. Melissa opened the front window of the Elm Room with both hands, feeling the weight of the wood frame give way smoothly, like a breath exhaled after a long night's sleep. A breeze swept in cool and light, brushing past her cheeks and catching the hem of her cotton robe. The smell of damp earth, early dew, and a nearby cherry blossom tree drifted inside, blending perfectly with the faint scent of ground coffee still rising from the cup in her hand. She didn't rush, didn't glance at a clock, didn't reach for her phone. Instead, she tucked one foot beneath her, sat cross-legged in the wide wooden windowsill seat her father had built when she was a teenager, and opened her book. It was an old copy of the Prophet Pages, yellowed and spine softened by years of hands. She hadn't read it since college, but today felt like the kind of day that asked for old truths told in quiet voices. Melissa sipped her coffee, bitterness balanced with honey, warmth blooming down her throat. She turned the page slowly, savoring every sentence, not because the words were new, but because she herself had become new since the last time she saw them. Outside, the town was waking up. Shutters clattered open. A jogger passed on the sidewalk, earbuds in, and oblivious to everything except rhythm. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked once, just enough to make its presence known. But inside the Elm Room, everything was still, sacred. Melissa leaned back, letting the sunlight bathe her face. It wasn't the kind of sunlight that blinded. It was the kind that kissed gently. The kind you had to earn by surviving the night. She closed her eyes for a moment, just to feel it fully. Her fingers tapped lightly against the ceramic mug white rim, chipped slightly, her favorite. And then, as if guided by a current older than language, her voice began to rise, not out loud, but deep within. A final voiceover, the kind that lived in bones. I used to think silence was weakness, she said to the wind, to the sky, to no one and everyone. That keeping quiet meant surrender. That not yelling meant not fighting. But I know better now. A bird landed on the wire just outside her window. Its tiny body hopped twice, feathers puffed, then stilled, listening. Silence isn't absence. Silence is space. Silence is the breath you take before truth. She set her book down gently, her fingers still resting between the pages. They thought they buried me under guilt, under duty, under the lie that being good meant being invisible. A deep inhale, a long exhale. She smiled, small, certain. But the truth is, I never disappeared. I waited. I learned. And when the time came, I spoke. She lifted the coffee cup once more, not with fire, not with screams, but with proof, with choices, with clarity. I found my voice again. And this, she looked around at the books, the light, the stillness, the peace she'd rebuilt from ruins. This is freedom. She took her final sip, let the heat fill her chest, then opened the book again. and turned the page, beginning the next chapter in silence, the kind that holds everything,